The Czechs have always done things a bit their own way, especially when it comes to firearms. They've always stood out for having designs that are a bit alternative compared to the usual trends. This was also true during the communist occupation of Czechoslovakia from 48 until the 1990s after the Warsaw Pact fell. And right within the Warsaw Pact, the Czechoslovaks famously didn't adopt either the SKS or the more famous AK-47, but instead came up with their own original technical solutions. This in particular is the WZ-5257, a carbine that was meant to be the Czechoslovak equivalent of the SKS, a very rare and also very interesting weapon. First, I want to tell you the story of this design. Then, of course, we'll take a closer look at it, and finally we'll test fire it here at the Campusia range in Spesa. To understand why the Czechoslovaks did not adopt the SKS or even the AK-47 for that matter, we need to take a step back in history and consider a few things. The first thing is that the Czechs, above all, had a strong firearms tradition. They had industry and industrial apparatus, and engineers who were perfectly capable of developing everything necessary for arming a nation domestically. Another very important factor to remember is the status of Czechoslovakia right after the Second World War. Czechoslovakia, which had been occupied even before the Second World War by Nazi Germany, was occupied by the Soviets between 44 and 45, but very strangely, there would be free elections in Czechoslovakia. One of the reasons why Stalin would allow elections in Czechoslovakia is because the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was very strong. It was a party that had gained popularity, especially as an anti-German force during the years of the Second World War. A party that, mind you, it would win the 46 elections, forming a clearly pro-Soviet coalition government. And it would be this very coalition government that would begin the rearmament of Czechoslovakia, even though it was not yet officially part of the Warsaw Pact. Despite the clear tendencies of the country's leadership, which was also personally very friendly with Stalin, Czechoslovakia still thought of itself as an independent state, even though it had signed an agreement to align itself as much as possible with what the Soviet Union was doing. However, the Soviets themselves were facing significant difficulties at that time. They had only recently introduced measures similar to what the Soviet Union was doing. However, the Soviets themselves were facing significant difficulties at that time. A new type of ammunition, they were still working on the development of the AK-47, which was not ready yet. It would only be adopted in 49 and would have many production problems, in fact, until the introduction of the KPM in 57. The Czechoslovak industry and military leaders decided at this point to adopt a semi-automatic rifle and a new cartridge, which they defined as reduced power. In a way, what we would call an intermediate cartridge. However, this intermediate cartridge is not yet the 7.62 by 39 that we know very well. In fact, the Czechs would use a cartridge developed by engineer Alois Farlik to develop the new weapon. The 7.5 by 45, a cartridge whose parameters were defined in 47, and around which the selection and development of a new self-loading rifle would begin. The most important Czechoslovakian industries got to work, and several designs came out, among which the most promising was the one from CZ. Named CZ 493, it was the creation of two brothers, two engineers, Jan and Jaroslav Kratochvil. The work on the new weapon and the new ammunition was very promising. However, when the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia lost much support in 1948, it could indeed be foreseen that in a few years they would make decisions that would be disastrous for the country's economy and society, so they decided to do the only reasonable thing: a communist coup. Thirsty for power, they then take total control of the country, which at that moment officially becomes a People's Republic and officially joins the Warsaw Pact. And in the arms development that was taking place, the communists, the Soviets, would intervene directly. The Soviets, however, continued to have problems with their arms industry. They had serious problems with the K. For example, there was even talk of abandoning the 7.62 X-39. In short, there was a lot of discussion about what to do. And with Stalin's approval, since the Czech industry was in a much better state at that time than the Soviet one, development on this weapon continued with only one change. At the very least, the bullet and therefore the barrels of the weapons that would be developed had to be of 7.62 caliber, so the 7.5 X45 was adapted accordingly. The shape of the case and the diameter of the bullet were slightly changed, thus creating the 7.62 X45. Meanwhile, development continued on the CZ 493. They moved on to a CZ 500 and a CZ 502, which adopted this new caliber, the 7.62x45. Meanwhile, the Soviets were requesting other features from this weapon. This weapon, which was a very elegant and lightweight carbine weighing only 3 kgs, started to get heavier and heavier due to the addition of many small features, such as a fixed folding bayonet attached to the weapon, eventually reaching 4 kgs. Fearing a Third World War, the early 1950s were particularly tense in relations with NATO, so the weapon was adopted, even in this non-standardized caliber, to start production. Called WZ-52WZ stands for WZOR, which means model, so simply Model 52, it initially faced difficulties in production. However, the problems would be resolved relatively quickly and production would continue until the entire Czechoslovak army was equipped. In the second half of the 1950s, Stalin dies, and this good relationship that existed with the Czechoslovaks starts to fade a bit. The new Soviet leadership would impose complete standardization of the caliber to match the Soviet one. Not only that, in 1957 the HKM was developed. The HKM would make the SKS and the WZ-52 obsolete, but it would also show the way of the assault rifle. While a new assault rifle is being developed, the one that would become the WZ-58, the caliber of the WZ-52, is also changed. It is adapted to the 7.62 X39 Soviet cartridge now imposed by the Soviets themselves to create the WZ-52-57, a weapon that will have a very short life because the following year the WZ-58 will be introduced, which will replace it. So let's take a closer look at how it's made and then we'll try it out. Here we are taking a look at this wonderful WZ-52-57. As we said, the fact that it's a WZ-52-57 means that the design was adapted to the 7.62 by 39. These are not conversions, be careful, but rather a later model. It's the adaptation to the more modern caliber, and we've seen the weapons designation. On the other side, we also find the serial number. SHE is the factory, actually a factory code, which was Daugersky Brod, the only factory that produced these weapons. The serial number seems very high, but actually here too, they use secret codes to obscure the production figures. So actually, it's not as high as the number of weapons would suggest just by looking at the serial numbers. Another thing that, especially for collectors, makes it clear from a distance that this is a WZ-52-57 besides the shape of the magazine, which is a bit different on the 52. Down here, by the way, you can actually put a magazine from the 52 into a WZ-52-57 without any problems. It's this pin. This pin, which actually holds the barrel in place on the 52, is hidden under the wood here. So there are some small differences apart from the caliber between the two models. Let's take a look at the front of the weapon. In the front, as you can see, there's a sheet metal piece covering the gas system. Then we have a front sight hidden by these large protective wings, which is a great feature for a military weapon. And obviously we have the bayonet that folds to the side. We can, from this other side, press this button. I'm pressing it now with my finger to deploy the bayonet, as you can see. The same thing, of course, to fold it back. Just press the button and fold it onto itself pretty intuitively. Here, there's a button on each side to access the gas system, which we reach once we start disassembling the weapon. Another very important control is, of course, the magazine release, which actually is very reminiscent of the AK. You insert it like an AK and release it just like an AK. Here we're dealing with a double-stack staggered feed magazine with a capacity of 10 rounds. They only made them with a 10-round capacity, but if you wanted, you could make a larger magazine, which is actually very easy to do. The fact that it has a removable magazine is something I like much more compared to the SKS. Other controls we find on the weapon, obviously the charging handle, which allows us to operate the bolt, and very much in the style of the M1 Garand, we have a safety. Back here, like on the Garand, there's the safety. By pushing this lever forward, as you can see, the weapon can fire just like this. Then we have a recoil lug. Here a pin that reinforces and connects the action to the stock of the weapon. As you can see, it's very firmly fixed, and then, as you can see, it leads to a stock. By the way, it's quite a hefty weapon. It seems a bit heavier than the SKS, especially in the front. But maybe the really interesting thing is how it works, because as always, the Czechs have to do things their own way, and we have some unusual features. In fact, just like in the SKS, we're actually dealing with a tilting bolt. But unlike the vast majority of tilting bolts, just think of the two most common weapons that use this type of bolt. The SKS has already been mentioned, and the FN-FAL, many of you collectors have one, famously has a tilting bolt. These are bolts that tilt the rear downward. It's the simplest way to achieve a tilting bolt. This bolt tilts forward, and now we can see the front part a bit better. It lowers and fits into 4 different small locking lugs. It's quite a unique feature. So how do we disassemble this weapon? It helps if the hammer is cocked. I haven't mentioned yet, but as you can see on the face of the bolt, there's a guide for the stripper clips. By moving the top cover forward, be careful, there's a lot of tension in the spring. You can lift it up and here it comes out with its recoil spring. The recoil spring has a guide, a spring that, as you can see, can be moved. It isn't fixed in place, it just attaches. Let's say lift it up. This is perhaps the only sheet metal part on the whole weapon, and it's very thick. This is the hammer of the weapon, while here we have part of the ejection mechanism, because this weapon has a rather unique ejection system that reminds you a lot, for example, of the Garand or the AR-15. I see a certain influence of the Garand on this design in some small details. Now we can pull back the bolt carrier, which is a rather strange movement, because we have to remove the left side first. It moves forward to a certain position right here. We can lift up the left side and pull it out. As you can see, it has the proper notches for the bolt carrier and bolt to come out. We can then take out the bolt itself. We start to notice a few strange things. So first of all, the bolt carrier. The bolt carrier has in front, which actually serves, since the bolt swings downward, to provide tension. Now inside, the extractor and the marking are actually this part. As you can see, it's this part of the bolt. Since the bolt lowers, something has to provide tension, otherwise it loses the cartridge. And the only way to give it tension, maybe I would call it a design flaw of the weapon, there's this small spring that has to, from both sides, push this extractor down. I see it as a potential breaking point. But as you can see, we actually have 1, 2, 3, and 4 locking lugs. Now I'll put it back in the bolt carrier for a moment so you can see it a little better. This is the unlocked position of the bolt. When the bolt carrier finishes its movement, so it moves forward as you can see, the bolt drops down. Imagine that the bolt in this position here is stationary. The bolt carrier moves forward further and lowers the front. The front, with those 4 locking lugs we just saw, engages here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 2 in the front and 2 in the back. A very, 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 very unique operating system. Really a typical thing. Honestly, you don't see many tilting bolts that work this way. Let's also take a look at the gas system, because that's also very interesting. We can press this tab and simply lift it up. Here we go. This gas system cover, as you can see, is a piece of sheet metal with a wooden insert. And here too we have something very special, because we have an annular piston, that is, a piston that goes around the barrel itself. We have a small hole that lets gas through, which will then push this piston, as you can see, which is around the barrel, backward. Then we have this element, which is an operating rod, which in turn acts on this small extension. As you can see, when I move the short stroke gas piston by hand, I get an impulse that pushes. Sorry, it came apart on me. The bolt, which pushes the bolt carrier at these 2 points. Very, very, very unique and special, I must say. Every now and then it's nice to see something different, right? It's quite typical, especially the locking system. I find it very original. Originality isn't always a good thing, because as we've seen, we have this strange system for removing the weapon. One thing, let's reassemble everything. Let's hide the gas system underneath here. There we go. It's assembled. Let's put our bolt back in place in the bolt carrier. The bolt itself, there we go, in the open position like this. Let's see, this is more complicated because here it has to be perfectly aligned, go under its slot here, and then rotate to the other side. It's a pretty strange thing. Oh, we managed to put it in. There's a bit of a trick because one side has to go in first and then the other, but you have to align the holes correctly on both sides. It's not always that easy. Now let's put in the recoil spring, then we should put on the top cover. Here we go. We need to push everything all the way in. You need to take care of the alignment of these parts for a moment. Hold on, it's easier said than done. Okay. The weapon is ready, so let's test it since it's really interesting. And here we are at the SCR shooting range in Spessa to try out this wonderful WZ 5257. It's a bit sad on one hand that it's a weapon that had so little history and so little recognition, obviously living in the shadow of both the Czechoslovakian WZ-58, but also the AKs, the AKMs, and the SKSs. So, the soldiers were issued 2 magazines. We have 1, that's why they're quite rare, otherwise it was loaded with stripper clips. We can insert the magazine nose in, rock back, so first the front and then the back, then cock the bolt and fire. And when the rounds are finished, as you can see, the bolt locks open so we can remove the magazine. So what can I say? In some ways, excuse me, I'll take this off. It's too hot for a wool hat, technically. It's still summer. In many ways, in handling and feel, this weapon is very reminiscent of the SKS. It's clear that as a concept, as a design, as a class of weapon, we could say it was created almost in competition with the SKS, as we said, because the Czechoslovakians wanted to do things their own way. But I actually like it more, and I'll tell you exactly what I like about it. So let's get the negative part out of the way. It's heavier at the front. The annular gas system, which we saw during disassembly around the barrel, weighs more. And it's a weight that doesn't really bother you. The weapon is actually well balanced, relatively well balanced. It has very visible sights. And I get the impression that it doesn't kick much. Not that the SKS kicks that much anyway. But remember that this weapon was originally made for a caliber that's a bit more powerful than the 7.62 X39, the 7.62 X45, as we said. And maybe the fact that it's massive, originally built around this slightly larger caliber, it makes it a bit more manageable and controllable in this caliber. The trigger is very good. The sights are very visible, very simple and easy to see. I really like the fact that it has a removable magazine, something that a modern shooter appreciates much more, instead of having to load the internal magazine like the SKS, round by round with stripper clips. I can see how someone could potentially make one. They only made 10-round magazines, but I can see how someone could easily make a 20 or even a 30-round magazine for weapons like this. Speaking of the magazine, let's reload it and try again. You know, bullets often go astray. After all, bullets are quite a capitalist invention. The true proletarian at a given moment can always raise the bayonet and with political enthusiasm followed faithfully by the commissar with a pistol. So, either the commissar or the enemy can joyfully sacrifice themselves for the party because the proletarians, the peasants, are just waiting to die for the party. Right? Ah! Absolutely. Ah! Another enemy of the state?
Okay. Let's try here. What a nice trigger.
Compared to the SKS?
No, definitely better than the SKS. Not so much for the recoil, well,
The SKS is also pretty weak.
it's a bit less, but that's not the issue. The sights are better, but the trigger, yes.
It's a good trigger.
The trigger is much nicer. This one! If I had to buy a 7.62 by 39 rifle, which I won't because the ammo is too expensive, I'd consider it.
Good. What can I say? It's definitely a very interesting weapon. For a weekend shooter, a collector of these weapons, it's definitely a very interesting alternative to the SKS. Sure, maybe if you need some spare parts, it's a bit harder to find, but still it's a very interesting weapon. Personally, right now, I liked it more than the SKS. I repeat, it's a bit heavier, but I really like the magazine. It's removable, and in general, I have the impression that it's a bit more manageable. Not that the SKS is bad. Do you know about my great love and appreciation for the SKS? I'm not saying otherwise. But this one seems, well, better made. Thank you all for watching this video. Remember that these videos are made possible by people like you. You, like the owner of this weapon who came here today just to let me film it up close. So thank you very much. If you want to contribute to the channel in this way, subscribe because I'm sure that somewhere you're hiding rare pieces that I would love to film. If you don't have rare pieces for me to film, consider, for example, subscribing to the channel or buying Saint Vlad t-shirts. They help, for example, with the fixed costs of the channel, like paying for the range or the gas and the toll to come here. If you don't want to or can't, at least consider leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing to the channel. YouTube doesn't like firearms at all. All the big corporations have never liked firearms. They censor them as much as they can. They do it actively because the government requires it. Recently, even Mark Zuckerberg himself, through a communication from his spaceship, admitted that the United States government actually forced him to carry out censorship on platforms related to Facebook. So I assure you that Google and YouTube do the same. They do exactly the same thing. That's all from me. And as always, I'll see you next time.